Chasing Light podcast, where we talk with photographers about their craft and life creating images. This podcast is super special to me as I've been following this photographer's career for the last 30 years. I had the pleasure to finally meet him at this year's NANPA summit, and I'm going to let a few famous people's quotes help me introduce him. Sir David Attenborough said, "His photographs are a superb evocation of some of the most breathtaking spectacles in the world." Morgan Freeman said, "He is a virtuoso whose eye brings home again and again the absolute need to preserve what we have." Jane Goodall said, "His brilliant and sensitive photographs is a powerful stimulation for changing attitudes." Robert Redford said, "His work tells a story that is overwhelming, breathtaking, and vast." Galen Roell said, "He has the broadest range of excellence of any nature photographer I know." Art Wolfe is a name synonymous with the art of visual storytelling. Renowned worldwide for his breathtaking photography, Wolfe has spent decades capturing the beauty of the natural world, showcasing its diversity, and advocating for its protection. Born in Seattle, Washington, Wolfe's journey into photography was inspired by a lifelong passion for nature and art, a combination that has defined his career and made his work stand out. Art Wolfe's photography transcends mere documentation. It is a celebration of Earth's wonders. Over his illustrious career, he has authored over 100 books, including the critically acclaimed Edge of the Earth, Corner of the Sky, and Earth is My Witness, which highlights his unique perspective and mastery of composition, light, and texture. His latest book, Wild Lives, presents a celebration of the beauty, ferocity, and revival of Earth's endangered wildlife. His artistic vision has earned him numerous awards and recognition, including honors from the North American Nature Photography Association and the Alfred Eisenstadt Awards for Magazine Photography. One of Wolfe's most impactful contributions is his commitment to conservation. His photographs are not merely works of art, they are powerful tools for raising awareness about endangered species, disappearing cultures, and ecological changes. Partnering with organizations such as the World Wildlife Fund, Wolfe has used his images to inspire action and advocate for sustainable practices. In addition to his books, Wolfe has hosted the popular public television series Travels to the Edge with Art Wolfe, a show that takes viewers on a visual journey to some of the planet's most remote and awe-inspiring locations. This series and other TV appearances, along with his photo workshop tours, has further cemented his reputation as not only a photographer, but also an educator, an advocate for preserving our world's natural heritage. It is with great privilege and honor to welcome Art Wolfe to the Chasing Light podcast. Thank you, Art, for coming on. I really, really appreciate it.
You're more than welcome, Ian. I'm happy to be here.
I always ask every photographer about, how they got started in photography. But I'm going to kind of change the question up a little bit and say, ask you, did your upbringing and your parents being commercial artists influence your decision to become a photographer? How did you get started in photography, and was that an influence for you?
Well, definitely my parents influenced me. And when I was 7, I was taught how to ride the bus downtown Seattle and then ride another bus upon what we call Capitol Hill. And that was getting me into a school of young children that were artists but could not afford any art supplies. In other words, post-war families in the early 50s, they didn't have a lot of money, nor did my family. And so I was availing myself to this school. It was called the Cornish School of Art for Children. So they encouraged me at an early age to follow my mother's footsteps in being an artist. And ultimately, I became the school artist in junior high and high school. And then I ultimately enrolled at the University of Washington in painting, fine art painting, and art education. And at the same time, Ian, I started hiking and climbing higher into the surrounding mountains of both the Olympic range and the Cascades. And my allegiances were shifting even though I never thought of myself as a photographer, I was interested in
Hmm.
capturing the hikes and the climbs that I was going on weekends while learning graphic design and the intricacies of art during the week at the U. So
Hmm.
by the time I graduated 7 years later with 2 degrees, I was all only thinking about photography. And
Oh, wow.
my influences then were drawing from all the artists that I had studied during art history. So I kind of blended the concepts of those painters and tried to emulate it through the photographic medium.
Doing paintings was your original idea, right?
That's right. And
Interesting.
I still have an easel, my brushes. I need to kind of refresh the paint, but as I get older and want to travel less, I want to fall back onto the painting. And
Yeah.
years ago, um, I did a body of work called The Human Canvas, where I took over
Hmm.
100 people and painted them into elaborate backdrops that I already had painted. And so that really reignited the interest in using the brush and pigment to create something. Only in this case, it was working around humans. And the ultimate image was a photograph, but it was the staging, the creative processes of creating those compositions that was not photography. Photography simply captured the art project.
I could definitely see how that painting in and that background, that art background, really helped, in your photographic style.
Ian, I just
Um,
taught a workshop in Jackson, Wyoming, and I'm teaching basically the essentials of vision and creativity rather than technology. And that is where my love lies, is the more my photographs look like a painting or an illustration, the happier I am.
so you're done with school. Can you share a story of your first major photography assignment and how it maybe launched your career, or how did
Yeah,
how did
I
you
mean,
build up to that?
I didn't build up at all. I one of my climbing partners was dating the secretary to the one of the main editors at National Geographic, and it was through
Oh,
her that I got a meeting with Mary Smith. And Mary Smith belonged to that generation of editors at National Geographic that really knew natural history, and and years later, editors came in from Women's Daily and other magazines, and they were good editors, but they didn't have a strong knowledge of natural history. And you could see that in the articles that came out in recent years. But for me, I went back to DC and met with Mary Smith and proposed a couple stories. They took them, and I went out and shot them. And one was on trumpeter swans that I traveled from Washington State up the coast to Alaska, photographing trumpeter swans. And the biologists I worked with predicted that, in 20 years, there's going to be 100 times more swans. And he was right. As climate change was even affecting the Earth back in 1978, it was predicted that lakes would open up. Now I'm kind of rambling on, but that was the first story. Long-eared owls was another story. I did a book for National Geographic on in the Soviet Union, but every time I saw the magazine, I thought, this is not the fine art printing of a really classy book. And so I
hmm.
kind of left magazine work. I did a lot of work for Audubon and Smithsonian and a lot of other magazines, but my love really was in fine art books. And that has not changed. And so even though there are books that never make money, it is a reason to get out of bed. And I love the whole process from inception of idea to the final book that comes out. It's a thrill for me.
Yeah, you've authored what, over 100 books in your career, and
I wouldn't say author though, because
okay,
we hire authors that know a
yeah, that's
lot more. about the subject, but I definitely have been the seed behind the book, the creation of the book, getting out there and doing the photography. And I'm often working on 5 or 6 books just to amortize the cost of travel. In other words, I don't, and you would know this, the advance on a book is so minuscule these days that it wouldn't pay for one single international trip, let alone what generally takes 50 to do a book. And I only bring that up because most of my books have international content. And
Yeah.
so, and I want the photos to be fresh. So I'm often working on 5 books at one time, and they're like planes ready to take off at any moment. So I've got 3 or 4 books completely shot that haven't seen the light of day, but they'll be coming next year and the year after. And I believe that if you always have a project, you have a reason to get out of bed and to stay, kind of sharp photographically.
And they're like giving birth, these books too, right? I mean,
It's exactly a perfect analogy. And
yeah.
and for me, because I don't have a wife or anybody to leave behind, it will be the work that I've created, and hopefully the influence of that work will live long beyond me.
Oh, I'm sure. And is there among, the books, is there one that you feel encapsulates kind of your artistic vision?
Without
Uh,
question, it would be the human canvas, because that
Okay.
was all reproduced in black and white. It was definitely an art project that used photography, but I have to say that every book I've worked on, I've given it all. Uh, and it's always going to be my best book until the next one comes out. And
Yeah.
I also want to add the element of surprise to my audience. I've got, as do all my colleagues, we have a cadre of fans that pay attention to the work we're creating. And I always want to surprise those fans. I always don't want to be so predictable that they say, oh, yeah, that's an Art Wolfe image, no question about it. No, I want to surprise people with the work that I do and
Yeah.
the subjects that I take on. As proud as I am to be labeled a wildlife photographer, it is not really what I am. I'm more of a generalist that keeps expanding in content and locations.
I mean, I have, this is the book I got from you, right?
Yes,
At NANPA. It's an amazing book.
thank you.
Just look at this cover, everybody. I mean, that alone is amazing.
That,
Um,
and I look at that bear, and every year I go up to Katmai and take 10 people with me and work with my long-term assistant Gabrielle Jacan, fellow photographer, I should say. And that bear is I've photographed from when it was a spring cub, and now it's got its own broods, and it still comes towards us. And I don't.
wow.
It's a high speculation, but I think these bears are so intelligent that they actually recognize humans, and we recognize bears because they're all different. They all have different scars or ears or color or pattern of their fur. They're not carbon copies of each other. So I can recognize that bear, and it's a friendly bear. It's a female. So I laid on my stomach as it was running straight towards me to lurch onto a pool of sockeye salmon. And I got it at that moment that it was airborne. Sheer luck.
And how far away were you? Because I've seen photos where the bear is like literally the nose is almost in your lens.
I have no inherent fear of bears. I don't want to pretend that they're my friends, but I think you can read bear behavior from afar and know when you've got a bear that's not used to humans, that may be angry, maybe just had an inner or a confrontation with another bear. So they exhibit and tell you whether it's okay for them to come by or you to be in the same river as they are. And often, uh, yeah, these bears will come 5, 10 feet away with their cubs without
Wow.
even hesitating. And I always counsel the people that are traveling with me not to run, not to get agitated, just remain calm and used me as an example.
Wow, that's amazing. That trip sounds amazing. I
It
may
is.
have to figure out how to get on one of those.
Well, you can do it because every year we do it. So
That's
yeah,
awesome.
it's a great experience, and we've had people come back 2 or 3 times because that experience of interacting and photographing a top large predator and feeling comfortable around it is it enables you to travel the world without fear, and I think
Hmm.
that is something I really evolved as I was catching a bus at the year 7 and crossing the city of Seattle. You know, it just kind of builds confidence in traveling the world and visiting remote cultures. I don't have those kind of fears.
Hmm.
And I think people
That's
that are fearful or tentative as they travel internationally can become victims because I think the few people in any society that could do you harm or take what you own look for those people that look tentative. And I just think look people in the eye, even
yeah.
if you're in a very foreign, perhaps historically dangerous location. And you usually come away with no confrontation, no problems. In fact, you build friends that way.
And discovered kind of, uh, I mean, as you have different cultures, right? And
No, it's been a gift, I think, in as we face our own mortality. Um, for me to have traveled the world and met people in the deepest recesses of the Amazon or in the mountains of New Guinea or it's like, wow, I'm very privileged because the camera literally became a passport to the world. And my parents, as I said earlier, we had very little money in our family, but we knew how to work. And so you're
hmm.
willing to sacrifice everything if you've got a project that you're working on. And I just feel so privileged and lucky I've had this kind of life.
So, your works such as Edge of the Earth, Corner of the Sky, and Earth is My Witness have received critical acclaim. Could you share kind of how did that, process or the ideas behind those projects?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the ideas start with a really good title, believe it or not. It's almost like the tail that wags the dog. Any rate, Edge of the Earth, Corner of the Sky was a translation from Ulta Matuli, which was a expression of the unknown, out there edges of the earth. And so I love that concept of going to locations that implied that, from Antarctica to Greenland to everywhere else I could think of, where the landscape was stunning and awe-inspiring. That's was
Hmm.
the mission of that. And it got me out around the world to places that I probably wouldn't have thought up without that title. And that was the Everest expedition that I was on in Tibet in the winter of 1984. We were the first Western expedition allowed into China and attempting the northeast ridge of Mount Everest. And so I love that out there austerity, remote place. And the other book you mentioned is Earth is My Witness, which was a title that my agent was going to work with Galen Rowell on. And yet, Galen, as we all know, perished in a plane accident. And so we had the same agent. And so we approached Insight Editions, and he loved that title, but it was his idea, the publishers, to do a book, and he referred to it as opus, and I didn't even know what that meant, so I had to look that up and said, okay, if you want to do a book of to date some of my favorite photos, this is the book to do it, and that's how that came out.
Interesting.
So I mean,
And
a lot of books over the years have had themes.
yeah,
Take wildlife as a concept. I've always been influenced by the teaching of Jacob Lawrence, and he was this African American painter of renown. And in his latter years, he taught at the University of Washington School of Art. And he always encouraged me to try new things and not be reliant on what I was comfortable or had a little talent in. Always experiment and expand. So jumping years past that, I would work on a book on international wildlife, but 5 books came out that were completely different because I had a different point of view, a different concept. They may have been the same animals, but Vanishing Act was camouflage in nature, which was very different than a book called Rhythms from the Wild, which was long, impressionistic captures of nature moving, snow falling, water flowing, birds flying, so forth and so on. And it was in the film days, so it was easier to get long exposures unintentionally. Migrations was patterns. It was inspired by the works of M.C. Escher. It was a book of patterns of animals. And The Living Wild was a book about wide angle perspectives, small animals in a big landscape. And for that book, we teamed with, I believe it was the NRDC. Now, we team with different organizations that use my books as platforms for the work they're doing. So that I know was probably something you would be asking of me. That is definitely how we connected with a lot of international environmental groups. We would come up with a book and say, we should run this in front of WCS, which is the Wildlife Conservation Society, or one of the books I did was called Tribes, and we hooked up with Cultural Survival with that book. And so each one had a great partner. And it makes sense from a photographic point of view that now you're plugging into a membership of tens of thousands of people, and they may want to buy the book. And so it serves both a great platform for these organizations to tell their story, and for a photographer, you kind of connect with an already audience.
Yeah, very, very interesting. I mean, I love the book with the patterns of animals that I forgot the name of that one, but
Migrations, yes.
Migrations. Yeah, that's really spectacular.
Thank you.
How did your commitment to conservation evolve over time, and kind of what role do you believe photography plays in inspiring environmental action?
Well, the first part of that question, at the age of 6 and 7, I had a little bird book, mammal book, tree book. Back in the 50s and all through the 70s, I basically knew every bird, every plant, every mushroom, fern in the forest. I was a naturalist at an early age.
Oh,
And
wow.
I actually had a gang of kids called the Art Wolfe gang. And there was a wooded ravine, a half a mile away that had streams. And we protected that forest. I mean, when kids were coming in to cut down a tree or build a fire, we would move in and kind of encourage them to leave. So that was ingrained in me long before I picked up a camera. And I think the photos that have been the centerpiece of a environmental movement is a very effective tool. And humans look at photos and remember photos, I think, as well as famous lines. And so photos can be the centerpiece of a concept that many people see and understand and care about an environment or a particular species of animal, or even a remote tribe that should be still living the lives that they choose to do.
Interesting. Because you've partnered with organizations like World Wildlife Fund and
Not
others,
that one
right?
in particular. A World Wildlife Fund is a good organization, but it's huge. And
Yeah.
so
Okay.
the projects that kind of go their way get lost in the paperwork and the sheer expanse of it. So I tend to work with smaller organizations where my work has a greater impact. And a great example of that was many, many years, probably 30 years ago, I was invited by the Canadian River League to float
Wow.
the Tassancini and Ulsac River, which was flowing out of central British Columbia out to the coast. And it was that river valley that a big copper mining company wanted to establish a mine in. And
Mm.
so one of the photos that I took on that trip became a national poster in Canada. It was virtually everywhere, and people suddenly knew what was at risk. And I happen to believe that the photo, along with really earnest environmentalists, dissuaded the government back in Ottawa to grant license to the Copper River. So I think that, Ian, is a great example of a small uh, single photo that actually influenced an entire country. And I see that in my colleagues' work as well, that photos become powerful allies to environmental concerns.
Well, that was what I was gonna ask you is, can you share a memorable collaboration or campaign that had a significant impact? Would you say that's probably one of the bigger
That
ones for you?
definitely, yeah, that definitely did. I don't know if any project. I mean, I've worked with so many different
I know.
organizations and publishers now over the years that I can't just say unequivocally the work I did really had an impact. But I always look at my work as a brick in a wall that's being built. That my part is there, but I'm teaming up with a lot of other very good and earnest photographers and writers. And so it's hard to say, looking back, that, yeah, this project was saved because of me. This project really influenced that. I'm not that arrogant, nor do I believe that my work is standalone. I think it's just part of a movement, and definitely a part of creating concepts and ideas of books that will down the road have a greater impact. People need to be reminded of what's at risk. And at this point, there's so many fires that we have to put out, literally
Yeah.
and figuratively, because the planet is changing fast. And currently, we have many leaders in power that are not the best people for environmental concerns or
Yeah.
even caring about the indigenous cultures within their own countries.
Yeah. And we're so congregated in large cities that many people don't even get out to see nature so much anymore, right? I mean,
I've heard that there's so many people on the planet that literally have never walked off a man-made walkway or
that's crazy.
cement-covered road. And now, obviously, they're stepping on their yard grass if they've got that. But that's an interesting concept to me, that people haven't been on trails or getting out into the environment, that they live a different kind of life. And that also explains maybe why people are voting for the wrong people in power. And, we don't need to name names, but you know who we're talking about.
Yes.
But
Yes.
it's not just the United States. It's Brazil finally put a good person in the presidency that cares about the environment of the Amazon and is trying to do his best on protecting that. But there's a lot of leaders around the world that are really into being in power and not leaving, and they love money and they love the power, but not the cultures, not the environment as much.
Yeah. Um, your photographs often highlight endangered species and disappearing cultures. How do you decide which stories are the ones that need to be told, and the challenges you face in capturing those narratives?
Well, I mean, I'm going to put a little bit of a swing to that question because
Okay.
it's very relevant for another book that's coming out next year in called Act of Faith. It falls within that category of books that I mentioned earlier, that nobody would associate me with religion. And yet I'm photographing all the world's big religions. But when it comes to deciding the smaller communities, I'm not. This is not going to be a catalog of faith. It's not going to be every culture on earth, because then it becomes a catalog and encyclopedia, which is very informative, but not necessarily art or
Art.
emotionally
Yeah.
affecting. And so I've got to choose based on where I've not been. And yeah, there's hundreds of tribal communities around the world, but probably there'll be 10 or 12 represented in the book, but not every culture and not every religion. And in fact, faith doesn't even imply religion. It's part of it, but it's what people believe in. And that may not be a religion. So I want to surprise my audience with this book. It's not a book about cathedrals, mosques, or synagogues. It's about people lost in their faith or impassioned. And so that is how I decided. I jump on the internet, and if I've never been to a place, I'm Googling images now, like everybody else, trying to figure out where and what might be of interest. But I also have 5 decades now of international travel. I've got a huge library that I'm reliant on. So I have a pretty good working knowledge of these tribes and where they are and what they look like and how they could fit into a book. And it's usually finding a tribe that still is very devoted to their shaman, who is the spiritual leader of a tribe. And that is what I want to document, because then it fits nicely into a book on faith.
On Travels to the Edge, um, you've taken viewers to some of the most, remote locations on the planet. What inspired you to create this series, and what have been some of the most rewarding moments of doing that series?
Well, I think the most rewarding part of the entire endeavor, it was a 2 year project, was first trying to get funding for it and
Yeah.
meeting with the people at Canon that went to bat for me, and Microsoft as well. Those were the two major sponsors. So it's not easy asking for money. And I know this because of the Everest expedition. We're always knocking on doors trying to get funding to lead an expedition that at the time was the most expensive expedition, climbing expedition launched, because we brought in neuroscientists and other
Oh, wow.
thinkers, and we brought in equipment, because in Tibet you can literally drive into base camp at 16,000 feet. So we were able to bring a lot of doctors and people that wanted to study the effects of altitude on the human body. Uh, I'm kind of getting off track here, though. Uh, I
Well,
think
no, that's really interesting. That whole combination of, science and while you're trying to create this art, right? That's
Yeah,
it's
I mean, it felt good to be part of an expedition of not big egos, which usually happens on big climbs, uh, but to be part of a group that was studying the effects of altitude, which would help future climbers. Um,
Mhm.
we had brain scanners and everything. I mean,
Wow.
I got cerebral edema, which is swelling of the brain in the brain case. I was down for the first 2 weeks, and the president of Boeing came in for the first 2 weeks, because it was really through Boeing that we landed that permission from the Chinese government, because we were selling jets to the Chinese at the time. Um, Getting back to Travel's the Edge, that really was the catalyst for going out there. And because I could see in Lhasa, Tibet, and the smaller towns en route to Everest, that the cultures were traditional. They haven't really been affected by Western creep. And so I knew that if I survived the Everest expedition, my mission would be to travel as far and often to document tribes that would inevitably change. And so that
Yeah.
was really the underlying catalyst for all the tribal work, was to document them. An earlier Seattle person, Edward Curtis, did that with the North American tribes. He was routinely criticized for staging some of the photos of the tribes. And now he's beloved by the First Nations of North America, because he's got photos of their traditions that nobody else had. And so often you see Edward Curtis photos in museums celebrating the particular tribal community in each location around North America. So I wanted to try to emulate his drive and his documenting those tribes before they would change. And that goes to the fact that we traveled into a lot of really remote locations. And that was dating back 25 years ago. So you can imagine what happened is Travels the Edge repeated some of the earlier locations that I had gone for books because I knew the area and I knew what to expect. That really helped us out. I think the most rewarding part of Travels the Edge was the fact it was broadcast ultimately to 70 countries around the world. Al Jazeera was the first big entity to buy the whole series and then broadcast it throughout the Middle East. And it's just, I always am amazed that here's this little kid in West Seattle in an impoverished family, and now the work I'm doing, my face is being seen around the world. I mean, I still can't get over the power of communication through the medium, and you're an expert at that. So that for me was the most rewarding, was actually building an audience and an international audience.
Yeah, well, I think you definitely did that and brought people to, locations and things that they weren't normally able to see.
Well, and Ian, the negative part of that was I never thought then people would go through what I went through to get to some of these locations. And yet I'm always now surprised that let's just take Iceland for an example. When I first went to Iceland, I never really saw very many tourists, if any. And then we did Travels the Edge, and it became broadcast to 70 countries. Now you go there and it's filled with tourists. And so I think over the years, not only myself, but my well-known colleagues realize that we've got to be careful on what we're exposing to the world, because in the age of Instagram, there's a flash mob that will go anywhere anymore, and they can get there because there's so many ways to find guides and fixers. Fixers are people that kind of put together a trip for you if you've never been. And now we're seeing photos and people going to all these places that we went to 20 years ago. Now they're going with reckless abandon. And I say that metaphorically because they are not really trained to go into remote tribes and not affect the tribes. And, with Travels the Edge, I told the crew, I don't want anybody ever to know that we were here because we've left T-shirts and baseball caps and anything else that may, in fact, change a culture. So there's a lot of responsibility about visiting a remote culture and not overwhelming them and not giving them our diseases or changing. I think the minute we lose a language or the minute we lose a distinct culture, we're diminished. And I believe that with wildlife and beautiful landscapes. We keep losing some of these languages. And I always like to make the analogy that when I first started traveling across the United States, you would see shops that were very different than the ones in Seattle. And that made travel fun, because if everything's homogenized and the same, which we seem to have arrived at, there's a less of an interest in going to other cities if they have the same stores and restaurant chains. It becomes really less interesting. That also compels me to travel to places like Bangladesh and other countries. I just traveled to Saudi Arabia a couple months ago on behalf of the Minister of Tourism, and I was given a free trip, and it was spectacular. I almost don't want to tell people how great it is, because I don't want to run up into hordes of tourists that are changing the culture of Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, there's a lot of gentrification right around the world of, Starbucks is everywhere, McDonald's is everywhere. Those types of things that,
Preceding that was the Colonel and Subway. It's even more international distribution. So Well, and then there's the times where the food that you're visiting, the food is so bad that you are going to go to Subway or the.
Right. Right. It's nice to see that and know you can get some sort of
Well,
food from
I'll
home.
give
I
you
don't know
an
how close it is, but
Yeah, I'll even give you a better example of that. It's Starbucks because it's a pretty medium road type of coffee, but it's so consistent. And if you're sweating and hot and miserable in Mumbai, India, there's a Starbucks that you can go into. It's air conditioned. They're playing beautiful music, and it's a place where it's like a mental relief sometimes. So as
yeah.
much as people like to criticize Starbucks, it is really that consistency of middle range coffee, but it's the air conditioning and everything else. It's an escape when you get a
Yeah.
little overwhelmed by the environment and the culture.
So, how do you balance the dual roles of photographer and educator, particularly through your workshops and lectures, and then television work? Because you're basically educating people too in when you're doing a show.
The balance is I'm not doing all of them at once, although in recent trips, like to India, Gabrielle loves taking videos with the latest iPhone. And so he'll catch me in moments. I'm turning around and the camera's rolling, and he'll say something. And it's a great challenge to be able to say something relevant in the instant that you're surrounded by naked sadhus in uh, at the Kum where there's 45 million other people. Suddenly you have to say something that's relevant. And I love that keeping me on my toes. I think that I tell people I'm a functioning introvert because when I'm not in front of a podcast like this or TV cameras or a class I'm teaching, I'm very quiet. I can go for hours and hours working in my garden or riding in a car with somebody else without even saying anything. I hate going to parties because I'll go to the corner and sit quietly. I'm not going to work a crowd and say, "Hey, I'm Art Wolfe," blah blah blah. It's not in my nature to do that. I'm also not the person to enter contests or seek out any kind of glorification. But when an award has been bestowed, uh, I really take that seriously and I really appreciate that. But I'm never going to enter a contest because I really think contests are for amateurs rather than
Mhm.
professionals. And I'm going to leave it at that. I think that talking in front of an audience was a great challenge for me because I would be the kid at school that would sabotage somebody up there giving a talk. I would have some snide little comment
Mm.
that would get the class laughing at the expense of the poor soul that's up trying to struggle. And when it came time for me to give a speech, I would go white and I could never do it. So I think Jacob Lawrence encouraging me to try new things in the art world, I also took that advice in other avenues, like speaking in front of a group of people. I also got a degree in teaching, which
Oh wow.
helped a little bit. But I'll tell you, 1 year out of college, I was a substitute art teacher, and I never was able to teach art. It was chemistry, it was orchestra, it was everything I had no skill in. But I did learn that and I was right out of college, so I wasn't that much older than a lot of the high school kids I was trying to take over the class. And I learned to be direct and to use my voice and be confident, and then suddenly people would listen to you. So that was a big breakthrough for me to realize I could take command of a class and get points across, which served me really well when I started meeting editors of magazines. You go in there exuding confidence that you can deliver a story. And it was very rare that they ever passed on a story. So I did like probably 15 different cover stories for Audubon. I certainly did a
Wow.
lot of cover stories for Smithsonian. And that was a great stepping stone onto book editors, which will put a greater emphasis of commitment financially into a book than just a magazine that comes out once a month.
Well, I
So
believe everything happens for a reason,
well,
so that's, that portion of going and teaching chemistry or whatever you were doing obviously was the reason that, that helped you for future uh, things like presenting in front of people.
I think that expression, everything happens for a reason, is what I often rely on too. That when things go south, when we're traveling, maybe a plane is canceled or delayed, I always try to say, for every thing that really disturbs you, there's probably an upside that you would not have predicted. And it's a great way to
Yeah.
live, actually.
Yeah. I believe in that for sure. Um, what advice would you give to aspiring nature photographers who are just sort of starting their journey right now?
If you have to ask, and I've often been asked by young people, what would what's the likely starting income? If you have to ask that question, this is not for you.
Right.
You have to live it. You have to be given over to it. You're not going to live a life like a normal American or a normal person on this planet. You have to work all the time. You have to be thinking all the time. And you don't have the life that other people do.
Mhm.
It's generally 7 days a week. I'm driven by the passion of what I'm creating, and so that gives me energy. When I'm working, I'm getting energy from that. If I stay home for over 2 weeks, which I'm about to do, I've got yard work. I'm hosting our state's governor next week
Uh-huh.
at a fundraiser. Suddenly, if you live long enough, people have to respect you. And that's what I'm finding. In the past year, I was awarded the highest honor from the University of Washington, even though I was a B student. It's what happens after college that matters. And
Yeah.
there's been other awards given to me. And it's comforting because, as I say, I never enter contests to seek that kind of notoriety. But when it's given to you after 5 decades of sustaining yourself and contributing, it's really nice. I'm in the last quarter of my
I
life,
bet.
obviously. And so to have that recognition, I have to be honest, it's really quite nice. And it's probably the exact same feeling that an amateur photographer getting an award in some international contest would feel too.
Hmm.
So I always found that the BBC, which I've juried, I even had an international nature photography exhibit when we gave out financial awards to the people, and it was fun to do it. But what I found about that is I don't have big enough staff to maintain it year after year, and if you're reliant on volunteers, they will contribute everything to help you for that year. But if you come back the next year, no, I moved on. So it was not sustainable on our level, but it was really rewarding when we did it because I saw the thrill of people that took a picture and got recognition from it.
Well,
I
I mean,
had one last thought about that. I
sure.
think because I've been the juror in these competitions, I saw how some competitions kind of evolved and it was a bartering system. And so
Mm.
rarely, I think, are the top winners the best photos. I think it becomes
Interesting.
very subjective to whoever's in the juror. And when there's a lot of jurors, then it becomes even less focused on the best work.
That's interesting. I mean, obviously, the recognition you're getting is so well deserved for a life of creating amazing, images. And I think that what you were saying
Thank you.
about, young people trying to get into, doing this is the commitment of, just enjoying what you're doing, And I get asked all the time, for people, how do you get into doing graphics or visual effects or whatever? And I say, well, first you got to learn how to live off of peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. And you need to, have the passion for what you want to do. And it's not about initially the money or any of those things. It's about learning and your passion and all of that. And that will be seen by whoever it is that, needs to see that. And then eventually you will rise because of your passion, and because people will recognize that in your
Well,
work.
I think that's well stated, Ian. I also think that in a lot of the classes I'm teaching, I'm getting retired dentists, retired doctors. A lot of them are technically skilled, but they want to be photographers now, which I encourage. But they want to know how they can make some money off their work. And I said, why would you do that? You've got,
Right.
obviously, if you're signing up on some of my workshops, you're making money or you have enough money. Why would you want to justify the work you're doing by thinking about money? Because the minute you have to do it for a living, there's a whole new stress that comes along.
Yeah.
And, it's like I still don't have a huge war chest. I've got 5 people that work for me and they all have medical benefits. So by necessity, I need to work. And that's great. I have purpose and drive to do that. But I just discourage the older people that have made their life's work and now they're retired. Why justify? Just go out and pursue happiness and passion, and that will keep you living longer, if you have that. And it's not necessarily photography. It could be painting, it could be writing, cooking, dance, whatever the humanity. I think dive in with both feet, but don't try to make money from it. You already got your money. I think the younger people have a harder road to walk at this point, and I would really encourage them to find a job that they can earn money and sustain and live, and then use photography on the side. And if you want to submit it to competitions or even take your work to a publisher, it's your own discretion. But get a job that's earning money while you're, in the first 10 years, it's really hard to start right out of the gate. It's just a
Yeah.
different world now.
Your images often resemble fine art paintings. Um, and I know this might be a hard one to answer, but how do you achieve harmony of color, form, composition, and perspective in your
It's a
work?
really easy one for me. I teach it all the
Okay.
time. 7 years of being absorbed in a major college art program, you understand color, the complementary colors like orange and blue and yellow and purple, red and green, when they are together in the same, value, they will really create a dynamic image just because it is recorded in the rods and cones in our eyes, apparently, and it excites our eyes. And so, if you have a subject that's got those color combinations, that's the first starting point. I make the analogy that those are red lights that attract my attention, and it's usually the color combinations. In terms of form and line and composition, there's some people follow rules to the nth degree, and I think that can be harmful for your creative process if you're just following a set of numbers. But there are good ways to record a landscape or a subject, and there are ways that take your eye out of the composition. So I kind of teach how lines within the composition can move your eye throughout the entirety of the composition, and that should be what you're ascribing to in most compositions, is movement of the eye. In other words, we tend to put our subjects right in the middle and the eye stops, and therefore the enjoyment of the image stops with the eye stopping in one location. Color, form, texture, all of those patterns, all those things are elements that I routinely work for, in regardless of the subject. You'll see patterns in the people praying in a mosque, and color in the wardrobes of Indians and, East Indians, I should say. I use all those elements that I learned in college to apply to my subjects, whether it's landscapes, close ups, abstracts, cultures. All of those have that information in the back of my head when I'm finding a subject to photograph.
Yeah, when you're doing, or photographing animals, that sometimes I would assume is hard to think of all of those things at the same time while you're dealing with the action that you're trying to get. And
Well,
that to me, it really stands out in your work because you're getting this action, but you're also getting this very artistic look and feel to your images. And I find that to be unique.
now this is going to sound boastful, and I actually said it just last week in Jackson, Wyoming. Somebody wanted to know what's my percentage of photos that are good or bad, and I just responded unhesitantly that I'm not taking any bad photos. I'm taking redundant photos, and I will remove those because I don't need 10 great shots of the same subject. But you kind of cover your butt on shooting that many. But in today's world, I'm not taking any bad photos. Why would I? I'm analogous to a concert pianist. If 10,000 hours is what is required to be proficient and skilled in any discipline, I've put in 50,000 hours. So I better not be taking any bad photos. Now, there are ones where the light is so marginal that you're experimenting with a long exposure, but I know I'm going to miss some shots because of that. But it's not knowing that you're gambling and trying to get something that you've never shot before. But on average, I'm not taking any shots that I'm just hoping might be a good shot. At the time I click the picture, it's already a good shot.
Yeah.
And people kind of roll their eyes as if I've said something arrogant, but it's true. And it's true with my top colleagues as well. Now,
Yeah, I
that's
mean,
not
your
to say,
experience is what's,
yeah.
of being out there and doing it.
And it's often knowing that maybe the fifth shot in a sequence on a subject might be more nuanced, but the previous four are also reasonably good and usable. And so it's not like throwing a dart at a dartboard anymore.
Are there any particular artists or photographers, that have shaped your artistic philosophy or your photographic voice?
I would hate to answer it the way I think you want the answer. There's almost everybody. I mean, I'm
Okay.
influenced by everybody. I not only photographers, but painters. And to give you an example of that and how the mind works is I took on a subject to teach about 10 years ago, and it was abstract expressionism, because even though obviously I'm really intelligent, I never understood abstract expressionism because I was much more literal in the way I painted watercolor paintings when I first went into college. And so I revisited 20, 30 years later the concept of abstract expressionism. And I started emulating photographically as I was building a lecture on the famous painters and why they became famous. So I started finding things that looked like a Mark Rothko or a Jackson Pollock or a William de Kooning. And I started finding those subjects. And what happened, and I did not anticipate this, but what I was building was a whole new way of seeing and learning and cultivating a visual vocabulary. And so now I'm shooting like a Mark Rothko if the subject's appropriate, or a Jackson Pollock, because that's the way I'm seeing now. And so it started off just building a curriculum, then it became a way of seeing. And that was intentionally broadening my perspective. And I love that fact. And so, yeah, painters, photographers, they have all influenced the way I see. The trick is not to copy intently their work, but take it on your own evolutionary journey. So what started off emulating a Jackson Pollock now has broadened into a very different thing, but it's that whole way the concepts are evolving in your brain.
Hmm. And I mean, do you mentally think about that as you're shooting the photo, or it's just because it's ingrained in you and you've studied or looked at
I
these
think it's a
people's
little bit
work
of
that
both.
it is?
You
Okay.
see something that reminds you of a Mark Rothko, but you're going to shoot it slightly different. And in fact, nobody would confuse the work for a Rothko, but it's a Rothko esque, I would say, or a Jackson esque type of image. And I love going to museums. I collect a lot of books. I'm like a sponge, but I'm not trying to copy somebody's work. I'm trying to take the spirit of what they were doing and evolve it in my own, set of principles or ideas or um, whatever's up here.
Sure. And I'm sure obviously the subject matter is different, but you're applying kind of
Yeah.
that idea in what you're doing.
Yeah. I mean, I'm loaded when I go out on a trip, especially to a new location. I am so loaded with concepts and ideas I can rely on, from color, as we talked about earlier, or form or texture or past experiences. It's rare that I go to any location and come away empty handed because I got such a broad perspective. If I was only a wildlife photographer or only this, then I would be limited. But I, and I always find it amazing when somebody says, "Oh, I can tell one of your photos." It's like, really, I can't, because it's so broad. If you know any of the famous French impressionist painters, you could recognize the difference between a Paul Cézanne or a Renoir or Monet, because they stuck with a style that defined their careers. Whereas I don't think I've stuck with a style. I've broadened it. I've kept it interesting for myself. I think if there's a style, it's the photo should be well lit and well composed, but it
Mhm.
could vary dramatically, as evidenced by the different books on wildlife or the culture stories.
So over 4 decades, you've traveled pretty much to every continent, right? And faced extreme environments. What are some of the most challenging encounters you've had in your career in these locations or any of the locations?
It's probably what you would expect. In other words,
Hmm.
I'll be heading down to the Amazon in about a month, and we're going to go to extremely remote culture. In the environment of the Amazon, after 2 weeks, I got to get out because everything smells bad. Everything in that forest looks like it's crawling towards you to bite you. And there's, in fact, cryptic animals in there that can kill you if you make the wrong step. So you're
Yeah.
always holding your breath. And because I'm a Northwest person, we're not tropical people, but I've done books on tropical rainforests around the world. And a lot of the subjects I do, you have to get into the jungles. The other environments are extreme cold or heat. And so I've been out in the middle of the Sahara or up at 25,000 feet on Mount Everest. So I know cold and I know heat. And I don't, I'm a 70 degrees kind of person. I love that
Yeah.
temperature. It's perfect for me. And, as much as Seattle gets comments about rain and misery, it is actually a lovely place to live from, I would say, April through the end of October. Then we
Mhm.
get gray and then we get the drizzle and things like that, but we get less rain than New York City. But that's the association. And we're quite proud of that because right now, as we're speaking, the Midwest, the East Coast is suffering under extreme heat. The Southeast of the United States has been flooded in the last couple of years. And we won't even talk about those storms in the Midwest, those tornadoes. Seattle is a very benign, comfortable place
Yeah.
to live.
Yeah.
And I travel a lot during the winter. So that doom and gloom of grayness doesn't affect me. In fact, I prefer overcast conditions to shoot, anyways.
Did you, it's my understanding did you go to Hawaii to just recently shoot the volcano?
Yeah, and in fact, we have a beautiful little podcast that Kyle in my office made from my stills, and I also wanted to shoot video, and so that he did a great job on that. And what is funny about that is I've got a book called Fire and Ice coming out in a couple of years. I've been on top of Mount Etna when it's exploding. I've been numerous times in Iceland, in eruptions. I've been to Hawaii many, many times during eruptions, but this one was unique. This one shot a stream of lava 1,300 feet straight up, and
Yeah,
the
I saw
source.
some of the photographs and videos. I mean, it's a crazy. I mean,
It is crazy, and the roar of the lava was also noteworthy. But what's funny about that is it first started erupting in mid December, and I was on my way to Indonesia on a scuba diving trip. And from there, I went to India, and from there, I went to um, back home. And then a week later, I was in Germany giving a talk, and then I went to Thailand, up to Tokyo, taught a workshop up in Hokkaido. I went directly from there to Saudi Arabia, came back a week later, we're in Bhutan, and then North Vietnam. And so I,
wow,
I kept on,
it's a
you know, that,
whirlwind.
yeah, well, I thought that eruption would surely be ended by the time I finished my major travels, and yet it wasn't. And when I got home, there were tickets on the table to Hawaii a couple of days later. I think the staff loves it when I'm traveling and not overseeing them. And in fact, I never do. That's another story about working with people. I retain people. There's two women in my office that have worked for 34 years each, and Libby's
Wow.
been around for at least 18 years. Gav has been my co-traveler for the better part of 32 years. So I'm a long-term commitment kind of person. And to have those tickets waiting for me to go to Hawaii because it was still erupting was perfect, because I was regretting the whole spring, kept on thinking I'm missing this spectacular eruption that occurs every 5 to 7 days. And we hit it right. And we hit it during the day when it went off. And I thought, oh my God, I wish it was night. But in fact, the lava is so bright that you expose for the lava, and then everything else around it seems like kind of mid or late afternoon. So the contrast was beautiful, and the surrounding volcano crater was important to have. So I was really happy for the first time it was an eruption during the day.
Yeah, I mean the photos and videos I've seen, they weren't yours, but they were, just newscasts and other things, were spectacular. That I mean, and how close were you able to get?
Well, you could get a
There,
little
and you might
closer.
not need to be close, right? Because it's
No,
this huge thing going 1,300 feet in the air. So
yeah, I was using everything from a 14 wide angle to 24 to 70 to a 1 to 500. So I've got
wow.
every position. I was in one location because the crater in Volcanoes National Park on the Big
Mhm.
Island of Hawaii. That's what we're talking about. It
Yeah,
You can't crawl into the crater. It's impossible, and it's against the law, and you would get a huge fine if you did. I was 2 miles away, but with a 1 to 500 and the height of that eruption I was very happy to be where I was. You
yeah,
can actually get a little closer, but then you don't see the whole entirety of the eruption. So we were in a really good location.
yeah. That's awesome. Um, I mean, just hearing your whirlwind trip before that, you just talking about that. It's is that like pretty normal for you?
It was a particularly busy time, let's say.
Yeah. Okay.
I'm gone a lot. I'm never around very long, but this was ridiculous. But
Okay.
each trip was they offered to come to Saudi Arabia, all expense paid. I couldn't pass that up.
Right.
And
Right.
we, 2 years ago, we sold out the Hokkaido trip, so I was committed to that. So there was no way of wiggling around these trips, and most of them we were bringing people like to North Vietnam or to Bhutan or India we were bringing 10 people with us that were paying. And that's how, you know, between the workshops and the teaching, which I love to communicate with people because I was trained as a teacher, it's also seeing the thrill on their faces when they've never been exposed to a culture or a place and everything's new. So you kind of relive your first experiences vicariously through what they're experiencing. So I
Yeah.
love taking people along. Long story short.
Is there a location? I mean, you've been to so many places. Is there a location or subject you've always wanted to photograph but haven't had a
Yeah.
chance yet to?
Yeah, it's the island of Socotra that's halfway between Yemen and Somalia. Not a
Oh
great
wow.
neighborhood, but
Yeah.
it's a unique island because it's got unique quiver trees that are only found there. They're called dragon's blood trees. Uh, the other plant life on there are unique. And the reason is because the way the winds work, the trade winds work, very few seeds of the continent of Africa and or the Saudi Arabian Peninsula actually come their way. So they don't
Hmm.
get a variety of other invasive plants. So the ones that are on the island have evolved over millions of years, uniquely different. And so that is the reason I wanted to go to Socotra, and I will. But the hardest thing was nobody was going there for the longest time because Yemen, which is still in the state of war, was
Right.
overseeing the island, and so there was no way to get there. And there is a community of Islamic people that live in a small town in Socotra, but getting there, having access was all but impossible. Now it's under the rule or jurisdiction of Dubai and United
Hmm.
Arab Emirates, and they have flights there. And now I've seen in recent years tours, but we just have, there's only so many days and so many books you can do in one year.
Yeah.
It's on the back burner, but I'll get there before I'm growing trees above me,
um, what
which
do
is
you
what
see?
my father is, by the way. I have
Yeah.
him cremated and I planted him under all the trees I planted on the property. So he's helping the trees thrive.
Yeah. What do you see as the most pressing environmental challenges today, and how do you hope photography can contribute to addressing them? I mean,
It's
obviously
simply
you do
the
that a
most
lot.
pressing uh, thing is the heating of the planet because the waters in the oceans are warmer than they historically have been. And that's killing off species of animals, but it's also generating the superstorms that were at one time 1 in 100, and now they're virtually every year. And so that speed of change is going to bring diseases that we've not dealt with. For the first time in my life, we've got mosquitoes that are hovering around when I'm working in the yard, and we never had that. So
Hmm.
now the environment is warm enough that I think all the grape growing from Napa Valley has moved into Oregon and Washington and British Columbia. And so grape growers are finding it difficult to stay up with cultivating grapes that are, sustainable during the drier, hotter years. And that's just a minor example, but it's emblematic of crops and what we're dealing with just the heating of the earth.
Yeah, I notice here in Los Angeles that like summer's been pushed into August and September, whereas it used to be like June, July, and part of August when I
Well,
was
look
much
at
younger. So it's even moving a little bit too.
Oh, well, you're having fires way earlier in the year,
Yeah.
as are other places across the country. Um, yeah, I don't. Yes, there has been heated periods and cooling periods, but with billions of people on the planet, we are generating the heat. Just the sheer amount of asphalt around the world is heating up the planet. And yeah, it's our challenges. You and I virtually have lived in one of the best times in the history of man. And I'm talking about the boomers. We've had,
Yeah.
and there's been generations since us that are not doing as well economically. And so it's an uncertain world. And I know people that are having children today think about that, or they should be
For
thinking
sure.
about that,
For
about what
sure.
kind of life their offspring are going to have to deal with.
Yeah, I have two kids, and I think about that all the time from many different perspectives, right? About, what are they going to be doing work wise? What is their world going to look like? All of these different things. So,
And
um,
yet, Ian, technology and NGOs are working hard on solving a lot of things that could threaten our lives. So you
yeah,
have to balance the good with the bad. The bad is we've got to get politicians that are not just working on behalf of staying in office. They've got to develop a whole new way of thinking. Otherwise, we're going to, well, God,
yeah, we can get into a large conversation about that,
yeah.
about
And
getting
I
the
think we're
money
all
out of the politics, right? And that would probably change a lot of it. But,
yeah.
uh, um, so okay, so we're coming to an end here, and I have one last question, and that is, if you could leave one message for humanity through your art, what would it be?
If I could do it, I don't know if I could do it, but with the cultures I photograph and the subjects I choose, none of them are depressing. They're all uplifting intentionally. Every window I look out is over water, mountains, or trees. I've planted a forest around my house to keep my psychology high and operating on a very high level of energy. I think looking at my photos uplifts people, and if it affects people, take for instance, one person just loves this photo and they're happy to see it, and then they communicate that to other people, and I think that you just affect a great number of people in a positive, happy way, looking at the beauty of the planet or the wonder of nature, or majesty of eruptions. And if those people are affected and happier, they're going to affect the people around them. God knows, with COVID and politics and climate change, people have a lot to worry about. But if your photos or my paintings or whatever we're creating affects the people that see the work, we are contributing quite a bit to the health of the planet psychologically. That's what I believe.
Yeah, I think it's this book sitting on my coffee table, and everybody that comes in, I mean, it's one of the first books I tell people, you should look at the photos in this book. So
Thank you.
um, I think, your work has really shown people, you know, um, about our planet, about people around the world, about, you know, animals and conservation, and lots of different things. And I think that it's, again, I'm honored to have you on the podcast, and I really uh, want people to, hear your story, hear, about why you've been doing this, and your love for the planet. And so I, again, really appreciate you being on and sharing that with us.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure for me as well. Thank you, Ian.
Thank you so much.